Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're going to be talking about, something that I think is on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
And that's the possibility of an extra $200 a month for Social Security beneficiaries.
Right.
And then also we're hearing these whispers about a potential fourth stimulus check.
Absolutely. And it's no surprise that these are really hot button issues for so many people. I mean, we're all kind of trying to navigate this somewhat unpredictable economic landscape. And these potential benefits could really have a significant impact on people's lives,
For sure. For sure. And before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of all of this, if you're interested in, staying ahead of the curve on these and other really crucial financial developments, make sure you hit that subscribe button.
Yes.
So let's tackle that $200 monthly increase first. This stems from the Social Security Expansion Act, right?
Yeah, that's correct. We've seen lawmakers like Bernie Sanders really championing this act, and it aims to give all Social Security beneficiaries an extra $200 every single month. Now, on the surface, $200 might have sounded like a pretty significant boost when this was initially proposed, but the reality is that inflation has just taken a bite out of its purchasing power.
Okay, so let's break that down for our listeners. How has inflation actually impacted the value of that $200? Can you give us some concrete examples of what that looks like?
Sure. So think about it this way. Imagine a year ago that $200 might have covered maybe a week's worth of groceries, right? But now with prices going up pretty much across the board, it might only cover a few days' worth. Or perhaps it used to be enough to cover a copay for like a vital medication. But now because of inflation, it might not even cover half. That's the real impact of inflation. It just chips away at your ability to buy the things you need.
Wow, yeah, that is a stark illustration of how inflation can just really erode our buying power.
Right.
So the big question is $200 truly enough in today's economic climate? What do you think? If you believe it should be higher, hit that like button down below. Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and this is where things get even more interesting. Our sources raise a really crucial point. Should this $200 increase be like a blanket benefit for everyone, regardless of their income level?
Oh, that's a great question. That adds another layer to this whole conversation.
Absolutely. Some argue that giving everyone this increase might not be the most efficient way to use resources. For example, someone who has a higher income, they may not need that extra $200 as much as someone who's really struggling to make ends meet. So there's this growing argument for a more targeted approach that focuses specifically on those who fall below the poverty line.
So instead of giving everyone $200, we'd be focusing on ensuring that those who are most in need are receiving enough to, stay afloat. Can you elaborate on what a targeted approach might actually look like in practice?
Yeah, definitely. So a targeted approach could involve setting income thresholds, similar to how we saw with the stimulus checks, right? So this would mean that additional $200 would primarily go to individuals and families whose income falls below a certain level. This ensures that the funds are actually going to those who need them most.
Now, you mentioned that this targeted approach might be more palatable to lawmakers. Why do you think that is?
Well, it really boils down to fiscal responsibility and budget considerations. Lawmakers, they're constantly weighing the costs and benefits of any proposed legislation. And this targeted approach, it's often seen as just a more fiscally responsible way to provide aid. By focusing on those who need it, most lawmakers can potentially maximize the impact of those funds while also minimizing the overall cost.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, let's kind of pivot over to a topic that's on everyone's mind, and that's this possibility of a fourth stimulus check.
Right.
There seems to be a lot of speculation and anticipation surrounding this.
Yeah, I totally understand why, those stimulus checks, they were really a lifeline for so many people during the pandemic, and it offered this crucial financial relief during those very uncertain times. And the fact that there's still this ongoing interest in another round, it suggests that people are still feeling the economic pinch and are looking for any support they can get.
So what's the reality here? Is another stimulus check actually on the horizon?
Well, as of right now, there's been no official word on a fourth stimulus check. The main driver behind any decision to actually issue another round of these payments is going to be the overall health of the economy.
Okay, so if the economy were to take a downturn, we're more likely to see another round of stimulus checks.
Exactly.
But if things kind of remain stable, it's less likely.
That's right. It's all about kind of reading those economic tea leaves, you know. While the economy is facing some challenges right now, it might not be in dire straits just yet. At least not to the point where another widespread stimulus package is actually deemed necessary. However, we're definitely keeping a close eye on those key economic indicators because things can change quickly.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Now, here's a question that we've been getting a lot. Is it possible to actually receive both the proposed $200 monthly increase AD, a potential fourth stimulus check?
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely possible to benefit from both. They're actually funded through completely different channels, and they have different eligibility requirements.
And if we kind of recall, the primary factor for stimulus eligibility in the past has been
Income may come. That's always been that deciding factor. And if we look back at the previous stimulus checks, those income thresholds were set at $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for married couples. This means that even someone receiving the maximum Social Security benefit could still qualify for a stimulus check.
Could you give us an example of how that might work?
Sure. So let's say someone is receiving the maximum Social Security benefit, which is currently around $4,000 a month.
Right.
That comes out to about $48,000 a year, which is well below the income threshold for individual filers. So even with that level of Social Security income, they would still be eligible for a stimulus check if one were to be issued.
That's an important point to highlight because it really shows that even those receiving significant Social Security benefits could still qualify for that additional economic relief.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding those income thresholds and how they factor into eligibility.
Exactly.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our conversation, and we'll be back after a quick.
Hold on one sec. Before you move on, I think it's worth emphasizing that even though we've discussed this potential for both a monthly increase and a stimulus check, neither of those is actually a guaranteed outcome.
You are absolutely right. It's crucial for our listeners to understand that these are still just proposals.
Exactly.
And there's so many factors that could influence whether or not they actually come to fruition. So let's delve into those factors a bit deeper in the next part of our conversation. We'll be back right after this.
Picking up where we left off, let's imagine for a moment that you're actually in the driver's seat making these critical policy decisions.
Okay.
If it were up to you, would you prioritize giving everyone that flat $200 increase? Or would you go for that more targeted approach, making sure that those who are really struggling are getting a much bigger boost?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It forces us to kind of think about, how complex these policy decisions really are and the trade-offs that have to be made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A universal increase, it does have its advantages. It's simple to administer, and it guarantees that everyone benefits.
Right.
But from a budgetary standpoint, it might not be the most sustainable or efficient approach. A targeted approach, on the other hand, that's a bit more complex to roll out, but it can ensure that the funds are going where they're most needed. So you're really maximizing their impact.
It's like this delicate balance, between offering support to a wide range of people, but also making sure that those who are really facing the greatest financial hardship are getting the help that they need. What do you think policymakers are really weighing, when they're making these tough choices?
Well, they have to juggle a lot of different factors,
That.
the state of the economy, of course, budget constraints, long-term sustainability of programs like Social Security, and of course, the needs of the people they represent. It's a very complex equation with no easy answers.
Yeah, speaking of those people we represent, we'd love to hear from you. Do you think a universal $200 increase is the best way to go? Or are you leaning towards a targeted approach?
Yeah.
Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this discussion helpful. So shifting gears a bit, back to this potential fourth stimulus check. You mentioned that the health of the economy is the primary driver behind, whether or not this happens. What specific economic indicators do you think policymakers are keeping a close eye on?
There are a few key ones that kind of give a snapshot of how the economy is doing. Unemployment rates, that's always a big one. If a lot of people are unemployed, it's a sign that they're having trouble finding work and might need more financial support.
Right.
Inflation's another one.
Yeah.
We've talked about that.
Yeah.
High inflation, it just eats away at the value of the dollar and makes it harder to afford those everyday necessities. Policymakers are also paying attention to how much people are spending. If people are cutting back, it can be a sign that they're not feeling very confident about the economy, which can slow things down even more.
So it's really a combination of these different factors that paint a picture of the economy's overall health and ultimately help inform those decisions about, stimulus checks.
Exactly.
Even though the economy might not be in, total crisis mode right now, we know that things can change pretty quickly. Are there any early warning signs that could suggest we might need more economic help?
Oh, absolutely. If you see unemployment claims shooting up, that could be a red flag. Businesses are letting people go, which might mean the economy is heading in the wrong direction. Another thing is a sudden spike in inflation. especially if it's coming from rising prices for energy or food.
Yeah.
Those are things everyone needs, and if they get too expensive, it can really strain people's budgets, and then you start hearing calls for the government to do something.
Right.
And then there's consumer confidence. If people are feeling pessimistic about the economy, they're less likely to spend money, and that can have this ripple effect, and drag the whole economy down.
So it sounds like policymakers really need to be on their toes, constantly monitoring these things.
Exactly.
To get a sense of, the pulse of the nation.
They need to be ready to act if they see signs that the economy is weakening. And it's not just about stimulus checks either. They have other tools they can use.
You're right. We talked a little bit about, other forms of economic support earlier. Can you remind us about some of those?
Sure. Instead of sending out checks, they might think about cutting taxes, particularly for people who are earning low to middle incomes. That puts money right back in people's pockets, encourages them to spend, and hopefully gives the economy a boost.
Yeah.
They could also make unemployment benefits more generous to help those who have lost their jobs cover essential expenses while they're looking for work.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are targeted assistance programs like food stamps or housing vouchers. These can provide crucial help for those who are most vulnerable.
It's good to know that there are different options out there. It's not just, one size fits all. They can choose the best approach based on what's happening at the time.
Yeah, exactly. A toolbox approach is often much more effective than just relying on one solution. Now, while we're on the topic of supporting those in need, let's come back to the Social Security Expansion Act and that proposed $200 monthly increase. We've been talking a lot about the amount and who should get it, but what about keeping up with inflation? How would that work?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make much sense if it just stayed at $200 and then inflation chips away at it over time.
Exactly. One way to deal with that is to link the increase to something called the cost of living adjustment, or the COLA for short.
Oh, yeah, COLA?
Right, which is already used to adjust Social Security benefits every year.
So instead of it being a flat $200, it would change based on the rate of inflation. Can you break down how COLA works and how that would play out in this situation?
Sure. COLA is basically designed to protect the buying power of Social Security benefits. Every year, the Social Security Administration looks at how much prices have changed for things that people typically buy, like groceries, gas, housing, all that stuff.
Wow.
And based on that, they adjust Social Security benefits upwards to make sure that people aren't losing ground because of inflation.
So if we tied that $200 increase to COLA, it would essentially get a boost every year to keep pace with, rising prices, making sure that extra benefit stays valuable over time.
Exactly. It helps make sure that the increase actually does what it's supposed to do, which is provide more financial support for those relying on Social Security. And it's important to remember that all these discussions about increasing benefits are happening against a backdrop of concerns about the future of Social Security.
That's a crucial point. Social Security, it's this lifeline for millions of Americans, and making sure it's around for future generations, that's super important. Do you think this proposed increase is a sign that policymakers are taking those long-term worries seriously?
I think it's definitely a positive sign. It shows that they're actively looking for ways to make the program stronger and better, not just for people who are getting benefits now, but for those who will rely on it in the future.
Right.
The fact that they're talking about ways to boost benefits while also making sure the program is financially sound in the long run suggests that they're committed to finding solutions that benefit everyone.
It feels like the conversation around Social Security is constantly shifting and evolving. Yeah. What can our listeners do to stay in the loop and be a part of these discussions? Especially because it can have a big impact on their own financial lives.
Yeah, staying informed is absolutely key. Seek out reputable news sources that really dig deep into Social Security and these related policy issues. There are also a ton of organizations and advocacy groups out there that are dedicated to protecting and strengthening Social Security. Following them can give you valuable insights and updates.
Right.
And of course, we'll continue to break down these complicated topics here in a way that hopefully makes sense,
That's exactly. We'll keep you updated on all the latest developments and give you the info you need to make sense of, all the changes happening with Social Security and other financial matters. Now, as we wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, that income has been the main factor in deciding who qualifies for a stimulus check in the past. Do you think that's the fairest approach? Should things like family size, location, or specific financial struggles also be taken into account? This is something to think about, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We'll be back with the final part of our conversation after a quick time. All right, we are back for the final part of our conversation about all these possible benefits, and man, It's been a lot to take in.
It has been a whirlwind, but it's so important to really grasp all this so you can look out for yourself and make smart choices about your money.
Absolutely. So let's do like a super quick recap for everyone, just so we're all on the same page. First, that extra $200 a month for Social Security. What's the big takeaway there?
Well, I think the thing to remember is, while it sounds great at first glance, that proposed $200 increase, it could use some tweaking. A targeted approach where we focus on those who are truly struggling might be smarter and more sustainable in the long run. Plus, it might actually stand a better chance of getting the thumbs up from lawmakers and, in the end, provide more meaningful help to those who need it the most.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What about that fourth stimulus check that everyone's talking about? What should people be keeping an eye on there?
Watch the economy. That's the key. If things really start to go south, a stimulus check becomes a lot more likely. Policymakers are going to have their eyes glued to those economic indicators we talked about earlier: unemployment, inflation, how much people are spending. If those start heading in the wrong direction, it could mean we need another round of stimulus.
So pay attention to what's happening with the economy, folks, because it could directly affect your wallet. Now, before we wrap up, let's give our listeners something to chew on. We've talked about how in the past, income has been the main thing they look at to decide who gets a stimulus check. But what other things do you think should be considered? Should family size where you live? Or if you're going through a rough patch financially, should those things play a role in deciding who gets help?
Such a good question. It gets at this really important idea of how we as a society figure out who needs help and how do we make sure it's fair for everyone. It's complicated. No easy answers, but it's a conversation we absolutely need to keep having.
Could not agree more. And we want to hear from you. Keep this conversation going in the comments. Tell us what you think should be taken into account when deciding who gets a stimulus check. And hey, while you're down there, if you like this breakdown of all these important money matters, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe for more deep dives like this one.
Always a pleasure to dig into these things with you.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and thanks for joining us.